When you look at the Philadelphia Eagles roster from top to bottom in 2024, there are a whole lot of ifs and unknowns. I'll tell you why coming up next on this Tuesday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast.
You are Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome in, Eagles fans, to this Tuesday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. I'm Louie DiBiase, your host for the day. You can also find my work over at Bleacher Report. On today's edition of the show, I'm going to rank the Eagles' deepest and thinnest position groups on both offense and defense and tell you why there's a lot of unknowns on this roster heading into a big 2024 season. We thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use our code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Yeah, I mean, to me, you guys have heard me say this on the podcast before. I think the Philadelphia Eagles roster in 2024 is my favorite on paper, maybe ever. Like, there are some teams that it came close. 2022, I'd say 2019, go all the way back to 2010. But this team overall, from top to bottom, I love it because of the style of player and roster construction that I like. I like a team that's younger, that's faster, that's more athletic. I love the talent they brought in at cornerback. A lot of my favorite players are on this football team at some of my favorite positions. They have a franchise quarterback who's mobile. That is something so huge to me on the NFL level at this point in the modern day. You got to have that kind of player as your signal caller. There's so many things I like about this team and the potential they have this year. It's so well balanced. I think there's a lot of good veterans, players in their prime, young pieces as well. But when you look at the overall depth of the team, there are a lot of unknowns, though. A lot of this is based on potential and not proven production. You could say that about starters, but you can especially say that about the backups. And I think most NFL teams would say that about backups because if they were proven productive players, they'd all be starters, right? So that might seem like an obvious statement. But I will say, I think the Eagles, over the years, their depth chart sometimes has been older. Like, they've had more proven players as part of their rotation, whereas now, probably because their roster is so expensive, especially on the offensive side of the football, it feels like every starter has a top 10 contract when it comes to average per year salary. But, you know, over the years, you've seen, like, even defensive tackle a few years ago, they had Linval Joseph and Ndamukong Suh, and before that, they'd bring in, like, Haloti Ngata and Tim Jernigan or Malik Jackson, whereas this year, and they kept bringing back Fletcher Cox, Javon Hargrave. Now you look at defensive tackle, which we talked about on the show yesterday, it's all young players. You look at cornerback, outside of Darius Slay, it's going to be all young players. Linebacker, outside of Devin White, it's all young players. Like, this team is very, very young, even for their normal standards. And so it was tough to rank these positions when it comes to what positions I think are the deepest and which ones I think are the thinnest. A lot of that is based on projection, but that's what I rolled through on today's edition of the podcast, so I want to get into it. We'll start with offense. The 6 positions I ranked: quarterback, the offensive line, both the tackle and interior spots, wide receiver, running back, tight end. Those 6 spots I ranked from deepest to thinnest. And I'll start with the deepest. And number 1, I actually had quarterback. You've got your elite established franchise quarterback in Jalen Hurts as QB1. And I actually really like, I don't like the trade they made for Kenny Pickett. I don't like the value they gave up for Kenny Pickett. I don't think he was worth moving down that far from the 3rd round to the 4th. But I will say, as a backup quarterback, I think he's just fine. He was not a first-round quarterback. Pittsburgh overvaluated him for sure in that 2022 class. He was abysmal for 3 quarters, the majority of the games he played for the Steelers the last 2 years. However, he had some clutch gene. Like, he was pretty good in the 4th quarter of games. He made some big plays against really good football teams. He's got mobility. I think he can make plays outside of structure where if Jalen Hurts got hurt, you don't have to totally throw the offensive playbook out the window like you did a few years ago when Gardner Minshew was the quarterback. And then you have Tanner McKee, who you would have to do that for in the playbook. But coming into his 2nd year, I'm excited to see what he's got. He was last year genuinely maybe the best preseason Eagles quarterback that I've ever seen. And it wasn't just that he was tearing up backups and putting up numbers. It was the types of throws he was making. The anticipation, threading the needle, these layer throws over the middle, these back shoulder passes on the boundary. Tanner McKee in August last year looked like a 10-year veteran. And I think if they didn't make a trade for Kenny Pickett, and in a vacuum it was just made the best man win for QB2, I think Tanner McKee could be better than Kenny Pickett. I think that group of three and then Will Grier as a camp arm for the summer, like that's a good group of four right now the Eagles have at quarterback. I would say it's the deepest right now of the offensive positions. And then number two, this is where it gets tougher because now, again, it's a lot more projection versus production. I went with the interior offensive line because you've got a big three that I really think is going to pan out, a young trio of starters at the guard spots and center. You got Landon Dickerson, who's established as an elite left guard. You've got Cam Jurgens, who I was really impressed with last year at right guard. Is he going to be Jason Kelsey this year? Of course not, but I think he's going to be a really good center for the Eagles. And then Tyler Steen, I think, is underrated and was getting unfairly almost projected to be replaced by so many Eagles fans and analysts alike during the pre-draft process, where I think Tyler Steen, coming out of Alabama, is a top third-round pick last year with Jeff Stoutland developing him this summer, is going to be a pretty solid starter. So again, a lot of this is projection, but I love those three pillars you have on the interior of the line. I think Matt Hennessy is a really good veteran backup that last year was set to start for the Atlanta Falcons at guard if he did not get injured. So you've got Hennessy in case things don't work out with Steen or Jurgens. Hennessy has some guard center versatility as well. Tyler Keegan, to me, was a steal on day 3 out of Michigan, played for the national champs, showed a lot of things that a veteran guard would show you. When it comes to anticipation, he's a very smart player, very powerful as well. Between him and Dylan McMahon, the athletic center from North Carolina State that you drafted in the 7th round, I think a bunch of these young guys are going to pan out pretty well. Like, that's a really deep group of young players on the interior that, again, Jeff Stoutland has such a good track record of developing players from not just the top of drafts and top free agent signings, but late round picks, undrafted kids, switching players from one position to another, guys that, in Jordan Mailata's case, never played football before. Jeff Stoutland has such a good resume that although interior offensive line is as unproven as, let's say, all the young receivers or running backs or tackle projects, Jeff Stoutland's resume with interior offensive line development and offensive line in general is so good that I put that as the number 2 spot because there's so many options there that I think Stoutland will get at least a couple of those guys to play at a very high level as starters and as high-level backups. So I'd go quarterback 1, interior offensive line 2, then I'd say wide receiver because, of course, you've got, to me, the best tandem of receivers in football in A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith. And then, again, like these other positions, it's a lot of unknown, but there's some potential there with Paris Campbell if he can stay healthy. That's 4.3 speed you've got as your 5th or number 6 target on this offense. You've got Ainias Smith, who's a gadget player. You've got Johnny Wilson, who's a generational height type of receiver at 6'7". And then you've got an elite punt returner in Britton Covey. You've got some physical projects with like Joseph Inata, Jacob Harris. You've got the comeback kid of John Ross trying to revive his NFL career. Outside of this past year with Xavier Worthy, ran the fastest 40-yard dash in NFL history at the NFL Scouting Combine. So there's a lot of players there that, again, I think a couple of them will pan out really well. I think between Ainias Smith and Johnny Wilson, one of them is going to be a player. And I think it's going to be more than what you got out of, in 2020 when they took John Hightower and Quez Watkins on day 3. I think one of them can be what Quez Watkins was, which was for a 6th-round pick. People crap on Quez Watkins as they should for the last 2 seasons, but for what they got out of him in 2020, 2021, even in some games in 2022, for a number 6 pick, like in the 6th round, that's not terrible. So can one of Wilson and or Johnny Wilson and Ainias Smith be a Quez Watkins and more? I think so. So I'd say receiver is with Smith and Brown and then Covey's elite ability as a returner, maybe more. I think that's the number 3 spot. Then I have running back at 4. Saquon Barkley is the best running back the Eagles have had in a decade since LaShawn McCoy. Kenneth Gainwell, Will Shipley, Kendall Milton, they present a lot of versatility. I'm telling you, I think Kendall Milton, I'm bullish on this kid. I think he has a really good chance of making the roster. He turned my head a lot at the Senior Bowl. I didn't even really know who he was. He's explosive. The Eagles have a good track record of undrafted players becoming good role players for this football team, if not more, even at running back. I think Kendall Milton can be a player. Like, I think he's a guy to watch out for during training camp. And then number 5 and 6, I have offensive tackle, and then tight ends dead last. Tackle, you've got the elite 2 pillars in Lane Johnson and Jordan Mailata. After that, it's pretty thin. Like, even though there's some unproven ability at running back, receiver, the interior of the offensive line, there's a lot of names there that I just rattled off for you, right? Offensive tackle, it's like, what have you got behind Lane and Mailata? Like, does Tyler Steen have to switch to tackle if there's an injury? Because if you got Mekhi Becton, who I think Stoutland can turn into something for sure. You've got Fred Johnson, who really hasn't played much at the NFL level. But outside of those 4 players, like, it's thin. And again, Fred Johnson's barely played football, and Becton's been a bust so far at tackle. So that's a position that could really wreck this season if there's an injury, is tackle. Like, Jordan Mailata and Lane Johnson, they've got to stay healthy. But tight end's the thinnest, because behind Dallas Goedert, who, when healthy, is normally a top 6, top 7 tight end in football, more likely a top 5 guy, it's brutal behind him. Grant Calcaterra has proven nothing at the pro level. Alberto, after trading for him last year, was a healthy scratch all year, and then you re-signed him, which is kind of confusing. CJ Uzoma, a veteran guy that doesn't really have a huge track record when it comes to catching the football and has an injury history. Tight end is really bad. I thought they'd trade for a guy maybe last year. I was convinced Zach Ertz was coming back. He didn't. He went to Detroit after waiting a month to sign with the team. This year could be the year where maybe they trade for Ertz this time around. He's with the Commanders, right? Or they try to trade for somebody else. That's the position I think they've got to make a move, because Dallas Goedert never stays healthy. So that's something I think they have to do. That and adding an offensive tackle are the 2 positions I think might not just be the thinnest on offense, but maybe on the entire roster. We'll get into that coming up next, though. I'm going to rank the defense 1 through 5 coming up next right here on this Tuesday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. Today's episode of the Locked On Eagles podcast is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time makes the NBA Finals tickets even faster and easier to get. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to tip-off. I think it's going to be between the Boston Celtics, we know they're in the finals, and probably the Dallas Mavericks. Bold of me, I know. They're up 3-0 on the Minnesota Timberwolves with last-minute killer deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee. Game Time's going to take the guesswork out of buying NBA tickets and the NFL. The schedule is out for the Philadelphia Eagles. I know a lot of my friends are already hitting me up saying, what games are we circling on the schedule? What games are Game Time taking us to on the road at Lincoln Financial Field? Take the guesswork out of buying tickets for the NBA, NFL. Not just that, though. Comedy, concerts, theater, and more through Game Time. Download the app, create an account, use our code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. You're going to get $20 off your tickets. Terms do apply. Again, create that account, redeem the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. Last-minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Thanks so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Guys, are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Got to turn down the volume with all the shouting? Well, make the switch to Locked On Sports today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On today's show, I'm ranking the Eagles' positions from deepest to thinnest on offense and defense. On offense, I went the deepest is quarterback, number 2, the interior offensive line, number 3, receiver, number 4, running back, and then the pretty thin positions, offensive tackle and tight end. On defense, some of these positions are actually deeper than on offense, and I think that's because the offense is so top-heavy with these massive contracts that they've had to go very young and very cheap when it comes to the depth. And that's even at their more important positions they value, like the offensive line. When it comes to defense, it's almost as unproven as the offensive depth, but there's a lot more top picks. There's a lot more players that I think you could argue have more promise than the depth of the offense. And I think that's because they need more of those guys on defense because they went younger and cheaper on defense. They went with more top draft picks, where again, the offense right now, the timeline, the life cycle of that offense, everybody's in their prime and everybody needed new deals at once. They're all elite established players. So Howie Roseman had to pay those guys. On defense, it's a bunch of first, second, third year players that were top picks that are trying to come into their own. So I think there's more names on defense with more potential, not as much proven ability at the top, but there's more optionality at each spot, I would say. It's not as thin. Number one is a perfect example of this, cornerback. It's the deepest they've been, I think, in my entire lifetime as an Eagles fan at corner. Like, they're 12 deep right now, and that's before you decide what you're going to do on James Bradbury's contract, Avonte Maddox. You've got Darius Slay, the 3 starters from the 2022 Super Bowl season. You've got your first-round pick in Quinyon Mitchell, your second-round pick in Cooper DeJean. I'm already at 5 guys. Then there's 3 players they love the potential of, Keely Ringo, Isaiah Rodgers, Eli Ricks. I'm already at 8. But then you have some important special teamers like Zach McPherson and Josh Jobe. I'm at 10 already. Then you sign Tyler Hall from the Las Vegas Raiders, who has some slot experience with Vegas. I mean, that's 11 already. Am I missing somebody? Probably. The Eagles have a lot of corners. Like, you could even say McKee Gardner, but he's going to have to end up probably switching to safety if he wants a chance to make the 53-man roster. Corner, again, outside of Slay, we have no idea who. Everybody else has a question mark on them, whether it's because of injuries, age, unproven ability because they just haven't played yet in Quinyon's case, or, just not enough in Ringo, Ricks, and Rodgers' case. There's so much unknown, but there's so much potential. And there's so many guys that I just think law of averages, a couple of them are going to be pretty damn good players for this team. So number one, their deepest position. And again, I'm not ranking the most proven positions. I'm ranking it from the deepest to the thinnest when it comes to how the roster looks on paper. So corner's number one. I would say number 2 is edge. This is a much deeper group than the last few years. You've got your big 4, Josh Sweat, Bryce Huff, Nolan Smith, Brandon Graham. They're going to command the majority of the snaps. But then you've also got Zach Bond, who's going to be a inside-outside tweener linebacker in Vic Fangio's defense. I think, though, he's going to play more on the edge. That's where he was more effective with the New Orleans Saints over the last few years. Then you've got your third-round pick in Jalix Hunt, who's developing. A lot of raw traits there to develop. Patrick Johnson has been a very important part of the special teams unit over the years, has been a rotational piece on defense as well. The edge rushing group, again, you don't have a bona fide elite star like Hassan Reddick anymore. But I said this on the show the other day. They're going to be a lot more consistent and a lot deeper than they've been over the last few years, especially last year where you needed Josh Sweat and Hassan Reddick to play over 70% of the snaps like every single game. I don't think that's going to be the case this year. They're going to get back to more of a committee-like approach on the edge, and they've got a lot of options. They've got 6-7 guys who can really turn some heads this year on the edge. Number 3, I'd say, is defensive tackle. I think you could use a veteran here still at this position, but you've got Jalen Carter, you've got Jordan Davis and Milton Williams, you've got your big 3 of this rotation. No more Fletcher Cox, though. And again, you don't have a veteran yet. Maybe you bring in like a Calais Campbell, but right now, behind your big 3, it's Marlon Tuipulotu, who's Jordan Davis's primary backup as that nose tackle, one-tech, run-stopping specialist. You've got Moro Ojomo, who I really like. He was a my guy for me last year during the draft. Earned a roster spot with his play in the preseason. Then had that neck injury, which sidelined him for a while. Moro Ojomo, I'm excited for. I think he could actually take a step this year. I think he's a guy that not a lot of people are talking about that could turn some heads at camp. And then you've got Gabe Hall, the undrafted free agent from Baylor, who Gino really likes. I thought he was going to get drafted. So, again, defensive tackle, the theme, like most of these positions, a lot of, hey, there's potential there, but we've got no idea how they're going to pan out. They got to go earn it. That's defensive tackle, but there's a lot of names there to like, and that's the number 3 spot. Number 4, I'm going to say linebacker. Got Devin White, Nakobe Dean, Jeremiah Trotter Jr., Orleans Burks, Brandon Smith. That's a guy I like. Another my guy from a few years ago, the former Penn State linebacker. The Carolina Panthers took him in the 4th round, I should say, of the 2022 NFL draft. The Eagles picked him up on the practice squad last year. This dude is rangy. He's tall. He's got length. He's got speed. I think he's someone that, again, quietly could make this football team. Another guy that I'm excited to watch. Linebacker, again, a much lower floor than in years past, but a much higher ceiling as well. I'd say it's number 4 because, again, you don't have a single guy, though, that you know you're going to be able to rely on this year. Like, even at a Zach Cunningham level, you don't even really have that on the roster. I think you're going to. I think between Devin White, Nakobe Dean, Jeremiah Trotter Jr., even like if Zach Bond plays on the inside at times, one of them's going to at least be able to produce in the way Zach Cunningham did. But it's definitely a lower floor position for sure. And then the thinnest position on defense is actually safety at number 5, because you've got Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, Reed Blankenship, and that's it for now. Sidney Brown is recovering from a torn ACL. He wants to be back by week 1. I think it's more likely. I don't know if he starts off on the PUP list, but he'll probably be back within the first month of the year. But for now, it's just CGJ and Blankenship. And then who else is even worth keeping on the roster? There might be some corners that you're going to have to cross-train, and you're going to want to. They've already started that with Avonte Maddox. Cooper DeJean is going to do that at some point, in my opinion, the more experience he gets throughout his rookie year. McKee Gardner is a guy they already started this process with as well last year at safety. I think there's going to be a big-time priority on keeping a lot of corners and having some of them make sure they have the versatility to play safety behind Blankenship, CGJ, and Sidney Brown. So that's the thinnest position right now. They could use another more traditional safety, but they have so many corners that I think can fill in if there is an injury to one of those top 3 guys that I think they'll be fine. But it's definitely the thinnest position on defense for sure. All right, guys, coming up next right here on Locked On Eagles, my favorite segment of the offseason, of the dead zone, I should say. My first thought on former Eagles players coming up next. Who are those 2 players? We'll get into it right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. Today's episode of the Locked On Eagles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. It's winner take all time in the NBA and the NHL, the conference finals. FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers, you're going to get $150 back in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 back to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, all of that and more. I hope you have more luck than I've had in the NBA. If it's the Dallas Mavericks and the Boston Celtics, though, I'm riding with the Mavericks. A lot of ISO ball between the 2 teams, a lot of just stars being better than your stars. Like, that's going to be the matchup. But Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving, they're giving me 2016 LeBron and Kyrie Cleveland Cavalier vibes. I think the Mavericks are going to get it done. I'm going to bet some spreads with them, money lines, player props, and more. You can do the same. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Thanks so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. We're wrapping up this Tuesday edition of the podcast, and it's time for first. And from the look at the 2 players that we're going to talk about today, I have a pretty aggressive thought, at least on one. So here we go. Let's start things off with the first player that you guys are going to know my reaction instantly, and it's former Eagles quarterback Sam Bradford. What's my first thought when I see Sam Bradford? Disdain. Misery. I've never been more miserable in my entire life as a Philadelphia Eagles fan than when this man was the quarterback in 2015 for so many reasons. Number 1, look at him. That is not franchise quarterback swag. He doesn't even look like a football player. He looks like an actor from a Disney Channel football movie. His jersey is too big. The sleeves are way too long. The sleeves under the jersey are baggy, unathletic. There's no arm sleeves. There's no QB band. The helmet is goofy. It looks like a punter helmet that's too big for his head. The aesthetic is terrible. By the way, he couldn't move. He was a statue quarterback who was conservative, would not throw the football down the field. And Chip Kelly said, I'm going to trade Nick Foles, who, by the way, won the Eagles their first Super Bowl and only Super Bowl ever, and a second-round pick for Sam Bradford to be the franchise quarterback. And I'm not going to try to trade up for a franchise-level quarterback. Of course, we know now he wasn't, but at the time I thought he was, in Marcus Mariota. Chip Kelly said, no, I'm hitching my wagon to Sam Bradford. It's just so unbelievably frustrating. And I'll never forget when they traded Foles for Bradford. the original report that got messed up by Albert Breer was that the Eagles and the Rams were flipping picks. So I thought they were moving up from 20 to, I think it was like 10 or 11. So in my head, I'm thinking, okay, this is actually a trade chip to go up and get Marcus Mariota. Like, Chip's going to actually do this. And it was actually recanted, and it was, oh no, actually the Eagles are not only giving up Nick Foles, but they're also giving up their own second rounder to get Bradford. It was misery. And then the Eagles gave him a contract extension after 2015. Luckily, they still said, we're going to do better than this. We're going to go for Carson Wentz. Then Bradford demands a trade, which was hilarious to me. That guy proved nothing at the NFL level to be upset that he was being replaced. Like, Kirk Cousins, even to this day, right now with Atlanta, is allowed to be more upset than Sam Bradford was. And you might call me a hypocrite because I defended Carson Wentz when he demanded a trade, but Carson Wentz had every right, in my opinion, to do that. He had a proven resume. Sam Bradford had nothing, no proven resume. He was just the even when you won football games in 2015, you never felt good about it. It didn't look fun. It just, oh my God, I don't even want to. Sam Bradford, yeah, that's what my first thought is, just misery. I've never hated watching Eagles, even 2020, which was so sad to me because I loved that era of Eagles football. I loved Doug Peterson. I loved Carson Wentz. I loved that core. Watching them die on the field pretty much over a 16-game stretch, especially during COVID, was miserable. But at least those guys were Eagles to me that helped you win a championship. 2015, they just weren't. It didn't even feel like the Philadelphia Eagles. That was the least amount of fun I've ever had watching this football team. All right, let's see what our second player is. My first thought on Golden Tate, the Philadelphia Eagle for just half a year back in. My first thought on Golden Tate is I like the here, let me rephrase that. Great idea, poor execution. Like, I love the fact that Howie Roseman was aggressive, trying to repeat as Super Bowl champions, seeing that his weapons, it didn't feel like enough in 2018 compared to 2017. His offense needed a spark, a kick in the ass, if you will. It wasn't dominating the way it was the previous year. So he said, I'm going to maximize this championship window I think I have, and I'm going to give up a third-round pick for Golden Tate. Like, I like the idea of him being aggressive and trying to surround his franchise quarterback with as many weapons as possible to succeed and get a title. Even if you're, again, I think Howie's done a better job now of balancing the future and the present, like short-term winning and long-term winning. But I liked when you would just won a Super Bowl saying, screw it, let's go for it. Like, I did like that mentality. It wasn't like he was the Rams giving up first-round pick after first-round pick, second-rounder after second-rounder. A third-round pick for Golden Tate at the time, to me, made sense. He was a pretty good player for the Detroit Lions, right? I liked the idea. And I will even say, giving up a third-round pick, Howie said this before, he'd do it again because Golden Tate did catch the game-winning touchdown in the wild card round against the Chicago Bears on 4th and goal, where they didn't even know the play call. He was improvising that with Nick Foles, and he caught it, and he made a couple other big plays in that playoff game as well. Like, so Golden Tate, even on the field, it wasn't all bad. However, a third-round pick for a guy that just didn't really fit the offense the majority of the season. Him and Nelson Aguilar kind of had redundant roles. Both of them thrived more in the slot. Neither one was a Z or an X receiver to play on the outside. In that way, the execution was kind of poor, and the Eagles coordinators and coaches at the time were not built to be creative and maximize players like Mike Groh and Carson Walsh. Like, that was not the core to make it work with Golden Tate and Nelson Aguilar. So the execution was a little flawed for sure, but I liked the idea. Yeah, I liked the idea. Kind of weird. I think people forget Golden Tate was a Philadelphia Eagle that year. So too was Mike Wallace, remember. So kind of a weird year for a receiver. Can't complain about where the Eagles are at now. But, I think Howie, even back then, he was trying. Howie Roseman has always wanted to surround his franchise quarterback with the best weapons he can. It's just now he's just executing at a much better level for Jalen Hurts than he did for Carson Wentz. And Golden Tate was, again, one of those, just one of many examples of him, again, the philosophy being right, but the execution being wrong. But again, it wasn't all that bad because he did step up in a playoff win. So for a trade deadline move, like, you've done a lot worse, right? Kevin Byard was worse. Jannard Avery didn't do much in 2019. Like, there's been other deadline moves you made that have not worked out. It wasn't the Jay Ajayi move of 2017, but that was another reason how he did it, and that's why I liked it, was the year before, he did the exact same thing, and Jay Ajayi put that team over the hump to win a title. Like, he was one of the missing pieces. So I totally understand at the time why Howie would have said, hey, let's try that again. That's at least the way I see it, even to this day. All right, that's going to do it for today's edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. Thanks so much for making us your first listen each and every day. Guys, again, make sure you go check out our Locked On Sports Today 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. You can also find it on Amazon Fire TV and the free Fire TV channels app. We've got our local experts of Locked On getting you covered on your favorite teams every day, plus our national shows covering every single league. That's going to do it, though, for today's edition of Locked On Eagles. As always, thanks so much for downloading, watching, and listening. And let's go Birds. Fly, Eagles, fly.